Most people believe who you are is defined by how you behave in front of others, but the truth is your most honest self only shows up when no one is watching. In fact, some of the strangest things you do alone aren't random at all. They're signals. Signals of a mind trying to rebalance itself in a world that constantly pulls it out of alignment. And here's the paradox: what feels weird in isolation is often the most natural thing your brain can do, because when you're alone, the performance ends but something deeper begins. You talk to yourself. Not just casually, but sometimes in full conversations, like there's another version of you sitting across the room. You rehearse arguments, replay moments, explain things out loud as if clarity depends on sound, not thought. At first glance, it feels like a glitch, like something slightly off. But here's the shift: this isn't dysfunction, it's simulation. Your brain, from an evolutionary standpoint, was never designed for silence. It evolved in environments where thinking was often externalized through speech, through interaction, through shared attention. When that external environment disappears, the mind recreates it internally. So when you speak out loud to no one, you're not losing control, you're rebuilding context. And notice this: the conversations you have alone are often more honest than the ones you have with others. There's no filtering, no adjustment, no social calibration. Which leads to something even stranger. You become more expressive when no one is watching. You make exaggerated facial expressions, you act out scenarios, you move differently, almost like your body is trying to release something it had to compress all day. But that's exactly what it's doing. Modern life trains you to compress, to minimize reactions, to regulate constantly, to stay within acceptable ranges of behavior. Every interaction becomes a subtle negotiation of how much of yourself is allowed to exist. So when you're finally alone, the system decompresses. Not because you're pretending, but because you're no longer required to. And here's where perception flips again. What looks like overreacting in private is often just unfiltered regulation. The same way a compressed file expands when opened, your emotional range expands when observed pressure disappears. Which explains another behavior you might recognize. You revisit the past, but not passively. You reconstruct it. You change what you said. Imagine different outcomes, replay the same moment with slight variations, as if you're editing reality after it already happened. It feels unproductive, maybe even obsessive, but this is where the brain reveals one of its most misunderstood functions. Memory is not storage, it's simulation. When you replay a moment, your brain isn't trying to trap you in the past. It's trying to update your predictive model of the future. It runs alternate versions so that next time the outcome might be different. So, what feels like being stuck is actually preparation. But there's a hidden cost, because the more you refine these internal simulations, the more aware you become of how differently things could have gone, and that awareness doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it creates distance. You start noticing patterns in yourself that others don't see. You see how you adapt your tone, your words, your reactions depending on who you're with. And slowly, a quiet question forms. Which one of these is actually me? Now here's the uncomfortable shift. None of them are fake. But none of them are complete either. Human identity isn't a fixed core, it's a responsive system. It changes based on environment, feedback, and perceived safety. So, when you're alone and feel like a different person, it's not because you're inconsistent, it's because for the first time there's no environment shaping you in real time. And that absence reveals something people rarely talk about. When external input disappears, internal noise becomes louder. You start overthinking small things, you question decisions that felt certain before. You feel a strange mix of clarity and confusion at the same time. This isn't weakness. This is cognitive recalibration. In a world flooded with constant stimuli, notifications, conversations, expectations, your brain rarely gets the chance to process without interruption. So, when silence finally appears, it doesn't feel peaceful at first. It feels like overload. Because everything that was delayed arrives at once. And here's the twist: most people misinterpret this moment. They think something is wrong, so they escape it. They reach for their phone, turn on background noise, fill the space again. But what if that discomfort isn't something to avoid? What if it's the exact point where real alignment begins? Because if you stay in it, if you resist the urge to escape, you start noticing something subtle. The noise begins to organize itself. Thoughts that felt chaotic start forming patterns. Emotions that felt overwhelming begin to separate into layers. And eventually, something rare happens. You hear yourself clearly. Not the version shaped by expectations, not the version reacting in real time, but the underlying signal beneath all of it. And that's where another strange behavior emerges. You start doing things that don't make sense to anyone else. You follow impulses that feel small, irrational, even pointless, like rearranging your space, starting something random, or stopping something you've been doing for years. From the outside, it looks inconsistent, but internally it feels precise, because when your mind is no longer reacting, it starts correcting. It adjusts direction in ways that don't always align with logic, but align with coherence. And coherence doesn't always look efficient. Sometimes it looks like starting over. Sometimes it looks like letting go of things that still work. Sometimes it looks like choosing silence over stimulation, even when stimulation is easier. And this is where most people misunderstand themselves the most. They judge these behaviors using external standards, productivity, consistency, social norms. But those standards were never designed to measure internal alignment. So what you call strange might actually be accurate, and what you call normal might just be familiar. That distinction changes everything, because once you stop labeling your private behaviors as wrong, you start seeing them as information, signals pointing toward imbalance or correction. Which brings us back to the beginning, the idea that who you are alone is somehow less valid than who you are around others. But what if it's the opposite? What if the version of you that exists without an audience is the only one not negotiating its existence, not adjusting, not filtering, not performing, just responding? And maybe that's why it feels strange, because you're not used to seeing yourself without distortion. You're not used to a version of you that isn't shaped by immediate feedback, so your own natural state feels unfamiliar. But unfamiliar doesn't mean incorrect. It often means undiscovered. So the next time you notice yourself doing something weird when you're alone, pause before you judge it. Look at it like data, not deviation. Because beneath that behavior, there's usually a process unfolding, a mind reorganizing, a system recalibrating, a self trying to return to something more stable than the version the world constantly demands. And if you let that process complete without interrupting it, without labeling it too quickly, you might realize something most people never do. You're not becoming someone new in those moments. You're removing everything that isn't you, and that's why it feels so unfamiliar. Because what's left was never shaped to be seen, only to be real. You check your phone, even when no notification appears. You open the same apps, scroll the same spaces, then close them without remembering what you just saw. It feels automatic, almost meaningless. But here's the shift. This isn't distraction, it's substitution. Your brain has been trained to expect micro-interactions as a form of grounding, small signals that confirm connection, relevance, presence. In a hyper-connected environment, silence doesn't just feel empty, it feels like disconnection from reality itself. So when you're alone, the mind reaches for fragments. Not because it needs information, but because it needs confirmation. Confirmation that you still exist within a network, and when that confirmation doesn't come, you simulate it, you check again. But notice the pattern, it never fully satisfies, because what you're actually searching for isn't in the device. It's in the absence the device is trying to fill. And that leads to another strange behavior. You delay things you said you would do, not because you're lazy, but because something in you resists starting. You feel the weight of simple actions replying, beginning, deciding as if they carry more friction than they should. At surface level, it looks like procrastination, but underneath it's misalignment. Action requires direction, and direction requires clarity. When your internal state isn't fully resolved, even small actions feel unstable, like stepping forward on uncertain ground. So your system pauses. Not out of weakness, but out of protection. Here's the hard shift. Productivity isn't blocked by lack of discipline, as often as it's blocked by lack of internal agreement. Part of you wants to move. Another part isn't convinced. And when those parts aren't aligned, motion feels forced. So you wait, not consciously, but structurally. And while you wait, something else happens. You start consuming content that reflects your current state, videos, ideas, concepts that feel strangely accurate, almost like they're describing you directly. It feels coincidental, but it's not. Your attention is filtering reality based on internal patterns. You're not just finding content, you're recognizing yourself in it, and that recognition creates a loop. The more you see yourself reflected externally, the more aware you become internally. But awareness without resolution can become its own form of stagnation, because now you understand the pattern, but you're still inside it. And that tension creates another behavior. You imagine a future version of yourself, not in vague terms, but in specific scenarios. You see how you would act, how you would speak, how different everything would feel if something just shifted into place. At first, it feels motivating, but over time it can feel distant, like you're watching a version of yourself that exists somewhere, but not here. Here's the shift most people miss. This future version isn't a goal, it's feedback. It shows you the direction your system is already trying to move toward. But if you treat it as something separate, something to reach, instead of something to align with, it creates distance instead of movement. So instead of becoming that version, you observe it. An observation without integration slowly turns into frustration, which is why when you're alone long enough, you sometimes feel a subtle drop in energy. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a quiet heaviness that makes everything feel slightly less engaging. It's easy to label this as low motivation, but there's another layer. Human systems regulate through interaction, through shared attention, mirrored responses, subtle feedback loops that constantly stabilize your internal state. When those loops disappear, your system has to self-regulate entirely, and self-regulation is more demanding. So, the drop in energy isn't a flaw, it's a shift in load. You're running processes that are usually distributed across multiple people, by yourself. And that takes more from you than you realize. But here's where everything starts to connect. All these strange behaviors, talking to yourself, replaying moments, checking your phone, delaying action, imagining alternate versions, feeling subtle drops in energy, they're not separate. They're part of the same system trying to stabilize under different conditions. A system that was designed for constant interaction, adapting to isolation. And the key insight isn't to eliminate these behaviors, it's to understand what they're pointing to. Because once you see them as signals instead of problems, the entire experience of being alone changes. You stop reacting to what you do and start reading it. And when you read it correctly, something unexpected happens. You gain leverage. You realize that the moment you talk to yourself is a moment where clarity is trying to form, so instead of dismissing it, you refine it. You realize that when you replay the past, your brain is searching for patterns, so instead of getting stuck, you extract the pattern and close the loop. You realize that when you delay action, there's misalignment, so instead of forcing movement, you resolve the conflict first. And slowly the chaos becomes structured, not because the behaviors disappear, but because they start serving you instead of confusing you. And this leads to a final shift that most people never fully reach. Being alone stops feeling like a passive state and starts becoming an active environment. A place where correction happens. A place where identity reorganizes without interference. A place where you're not just existing, you're recalibrating. And once you see it that way, the question changes. It's no longer, why do I do strange things when I'm alone? It becomes, what is my system trying to fix when no one else is around? Because that question doesn't judge the behavior. It decodes it. And in that decoding, you recover something most people lose in constant noise. A direct relationship with your own mind. Not filtered, not optimized for others, not shaped by expectation, just accurate. And accuracy, even when it feels uncomfortable, is the only place real change can begin. So maybe the strangest thing you do when you're alone is finally seeing yourself without interruption and not looking away.